Hello, I am Captain William Marlowe, and I'm currently the Medical Readiness Officer at the 459th Aerospace Medicine Squadron at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. I currently serve as a Medical Readiness Officer where I'm in charge of all the readiness functions and trainings for my entire unit. My civilian job, because being a reservist, is the Chief Administrative Officer at the ARC Rockland, which is an organization that provides services for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. I've been at this position for about a year and a half, and my job entails real estate development, IT, and fundraising. In context of AirPower, my experience has been my deployment to Al-Udeid Air Base, where I served as the aeromedical evacuation operations officer, where I launch and recover all the medical missions to evacuate wounded troops, both coalition, Air Force, and other branches. So that was my most pertinent experience in joint operations and AirPower. The content that made me think differently about AirPower from the previous self-paced courses was the way in which space was discussed in the context of AirPower. Previously, I used to think AirPower was operational control over a battlefield, operational control over home airspace, control over an ally's airspace, and quite frankly, the power of weaponry. It was interesting to think in terms of space. Space, when it discussed there's no set geographical boundaries, when you think about that, it makes you think, okay, does the area of space that extends from the footprint of the United States all the way up into space, is that the boundary that one has to follow when taking into account space warfare? I think it made me think differently. It made me think from a more multifaceted approach to AirPower, and I think that was a interesting turning point, at least in my career in the Air Force, to think of it that way. In terms of joint operations, I think it was interesting that the articles preceding this course discuss the need for one centralized, essentially combatant commander to ensure the operational control of battlefield, to coordinate air power use in terms of munition drops for land warfare. In addition, I'd like to discuss the change in my thought process after reading about the national security articles that were presented in the self-paced portion of the course. I was surprised to read about the true extent in which cyber warfare can disrupt almost all aspects of life in America, not just from a military aspect. So, for example, cyber attacks that shut down a power grid or the banking system. We tend to think in terms of purely military perspective, when it's important to realize the day-to-day lives of Americans can truly be disrupted with a cyber attack. So I think the cyber aspect of the previous presentations really changed my thought process in terms of national security as a whole. It's not just security from a physical security standpoint, but from an economic security standpoint, and from just continuing the way of life that we're fortunate to have. So I think that was kind of an eye-opening moment for me. So I was very excited to learn about that, and I think it was very important in my growth as an officer. I feel a critical issue related to air power in the context of national security is cyber warfare. As I mentioned in my previous section, cyber warfare is an issue that I just learned the extent in which it can be damaging to the United States military and economy as a whole. I think General Goldfein stated it best when he said, "My job," and I quote, "My job is to organize, train, and equip and present ready cyber forces to the cybercom and strategic commander so that they can actually employ them in the fight. We stood up a numbered Air Force to do that, the 24th Air Force, but we're about 65% now complete." When you think about that, saying we're only at a 65% readiness level, let's say, to stand up the cybercom, I think is telling of how far behind we are, at least stated how far behind we are. In reality, it might not be that low. We may be ahead of the curve a little bit, but it's interesting to hear General Goldfein state that. So I think that when he says that, you have to stand up and take notice that as being a major issue facing the Air Force and a threat to our air power that the United States currently has. I think a second critical issue related to air power is actually morale. As I stated previously, I'm in a medical unit, and it's often difficult for people on the medical side, as opposed to the line side, to see their role in air power as a whole. And I think being more acknowledging of everybody's small portion that they can contribute towards air power is something that is actually a threat to air power. I don't morale issues exist, as we know, and I think part of that is because we glorify flyers. I think flyers obviously are important. We're the Air Force, they're the backbone of our Air Force, but it also seems that all the attention is paid on them. So I think that helps to create a serious morale issue that denigrates the air power of the United States Air Force.